like to just start. I would like to welcome you to this event for Environment Bound. And I would like to acknowledge that we are on the territories of the Mississaugas of the First Credit Nation. We share this land. We hope to contribute to stewarding this land in the best ways possible. And my name is Madhur Anand. I am the current director of the Guelph Institute for Environmental Research. I will say a few words about the Institute to everyone present here. We have a wonderful turnout. It's a relatively new institute here at the university. It was established in fall 2019. And the aims of the Institute are to really bring together researchers and practitioners, both within the university and in our environs, who are interested in dealing with our environmental crises, whether we're talking about the climate emergency or biodiversity declines, and especially at the interface of disciplines. So at the Institute, we do recognize that traditionally in academia, research is sort of partitioned out into natural sciences and engineering, social sciences and humanities, and the arts. And what we're really interested in exploring at the Institute are where two or more of those areas interface. So we have a number of activities that we are organizing around those interfaces. We provide funds, and we do invite you, and perhaps Leanne, our GIER officer, can put into the chat the address of our website, so you can get a better feel for some of the things that we provide and that we nourish and nurture. And some of these things are direct in terms of funding for interdisciplinary research, and some are more indirect in terms of stimulating conversations within the university and with the community. So please do have a look at some of the things that we're doing. If you would like to hear about more of our events and participate more directly with the Institute, I invite you to email me. I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. It's just manand@uoguelph.ca. Or you can also email us at the Institute, and Leanne will add that information into the chat. Okay, well, today we're so excited to be presenting to you one of our Environment Bound events. Environment Bound is a series that we are curating here at the Institute that looks at writing in any genre that explores issues on the environment. And today we are celebrating this book here. As you all know, The World as We Knew It, by editors Amy Brady and Tajja Isen, and we're so thrilled to have both of them here with us today to discuss this anthology. I've already told them that I read it, and really think it's a wonderful, wonderful book. But let's dive deeper into that with both of them. I will start by introducing them to you. So Tajja Isen is a writer, editor, and voice actor whose work exists at the intersection of cultural criticism and personal narrative. She is editor-in-chief of Catapult magazine, wonderful magazine, the former digital editor for The Walrus, another wonderful magazine, and author of the essay collection, Some of My Best Friends, Essays on Lip Surface, which I'm just in the process of reading. Her essays and criticism have appeared in dozens of outlets across the US and Canada, and she is co-editor of, as we know, the anthology, The World as We Knew It, Dispatches from a Changing Climate, alongside Amy Brady. Amy, is a writer, editor, and lecturer focusing on culture, environmentalism, and climate change. She received her PhD in English from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and is currently executive director of Orion magazine, phenomenal magazine that I hope, if you guys are not familiar with it, you'll look it up because it's quite relevant to, you know, if you're interested in the environment, it's definitely something for you to check out. Amy also frequently lectures at conferences and college campuses around the country about climate change and the art of storytelling. She is co-editor of this anthology we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to start with each of the editors providing a bit of an introduction. I mean, both of them have written an actual introduction to the book. And I'm going to turn it over to them to spend a little bit of time introducing us to the book. And then we will have plenty of time, I hope, for questions and discussion towards the end. So we do have an hour together. And I do encourage you to put your questions into the chat and we will try to get to them. I myself have 3 big questions that I want to get in, but I will defer to our wonderful group here because I know you will all have burning questions by the end of it as well. So turning it over, Amy, are you going to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to.
Wonderful.
Great. Well, thank you, Madhur. Thank you to the University of Guelph for having us. Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your busy day to join us so that we can discuss this book, writing about the climate crisis and whatever other questions that you may have for us today. Tajja, it's so good to see you. I always so enjoy these events with you. And I suppose a good way to start is just very briefly to talk about how this collection came together. And then I'll read briefly from an introduction to the book, and Tajja is going to read from one of our favorite essays in the book. So with that said, I guess I will start in the year 2018, which is when this book really started to come together. And I'm somebody who has contributed to and just studied the literature of the climate crisis for some time. And in that year, I noticed that most of the writing about climate change was focused on the macro level, right? About large scale weather events and catastrophes that were affecting entire communities. And with good reason, because they are catastrophic. But what was left out largely from those conversations was how the crisis was impacting people at the level of a life. And that was the level that I was very curious in as a writer, as an editor, and just as a human being who is, like all of you, living through an age of accelerated climate change and have a lot of feelings about that. And so I thought, what a great opportunity for an anthology. And the first thing I did was look at other anthologies that I admire. And what I noticed is that all of them are edited by 2 people. And boy, is it a good thing. I think Tajja will agree that having a co-editor for an anthology is a lifesaver. And so I immediately reached out to Tajja to see if she would join me in this project because I knew her to be a sensible and incredibly talented editor with impeccable instincts. And it made my day and my life when she said yes. And so here we are today, finally, with this book that we are so happy to share with the world. So I suppose with that, Tajja, do you want me to go ahead and just read from the introduction briefly?
Yeah, let's hear from the intro.
Okay, great. So this is from the introduction to this book, and it will go into a bit more detail about how this book came together and what it comprises. Summer nights in Kansas used to be so alive with the sounds of insects and animals that if you wanted to tell a story, you had to shout to be heard. The trees vibrated with the droning of locusts, the weeds shook with crickets, frogs bellowed up and down the creeks. The Brady family spent most summer evenings in the backyard, where we sat on torn folding chairs beneath a flickering porch light, hollering at one another to be heard over the night's wild buzzing. The kids, myself included, would chase fireflies. In those days, the darkness out in rural Kansas was still complete, an inky black pierced only by the porch light and the blinking bugs and the headlights of the occasional car that zoomed down the distant Interstate 70. In all that darkness, the fireflies were a cloud of light. When they swerved, so did I, an open glass jar held tightly in one hand, a metal lid with 3 tiny holes in the other. Once, I tripped on a twig and went crashing down into the grass. Knees burning, I rolled over and stared up at the night sky. The fireflies and stars so thoroughly blended that I couldn't tell when a stream of light was a bug or a shooting star. It never occurred to me that nights like those wouldn't always be possible. These days, summers in Kansas have changed. Thermometer readings now regularly reach the upper 90s. Corn and milo crops are suffering, and some people without air conditioning are routinely hospitalized with heat stroke. Now a New Yorker, I recently visited my family back in Kansas. The old house has been sold, but my father still lives there in Topeka. The silence of the animals and insects on this trip was unsettling, and owing to the development of more grocery stores and restaurants, the darkness was gone as well. Here was a landscape so familiar I could draw a map from memory, and yet it felt strange to me. That peculiar feeling has become recognizable to many people around the world. In 2022, we are witnesses to one of the most transformative moments in human history, a time when climate change is altering life on Earth at an unprecedented rate, but also a time when the majority of us can still remember when things were more stable. We are among the first, and perhaps one of the last, human populations to have memories of what life was like before. To us, the new normal is not yet how it's always been. Our lives jostle against incongruous memories of familiar places. We are forced to confront in strange and sometimes painful ways how much those places have changed. When we think of environmental crises, our minds might go first to extreme weather events like Superstorm Sandy, whose size and scale were amplified by climate change. At approximately 8 p.m. on October 29, 2012, Sandy struck Atlantic City, New Jersey. That night, a full moon hung in the turbulent sky, pulling the ocean tides a full 20% higher than normal and increasing Sandy's storm surge. Seawater rose along the eastern seaboard toward New York City and then poured into Manhattan, flooding subways and sidewalks. More than 600,000 people lost power throughout the 5 boroughs. Many would be without electricity for more than a week. The years since Sandy have seen an escalating series of even larger events. In 2020, there were so many tropical storms that the World Meteorological Organization nearly ran out of names for them. But the connections between humans and the natural world go beyond extreme weather events. As the Earth warms, other devastating phenomena continue to thrash the planet. Invasive species migrate to cooler climates, choking off local wildlife and creating potentially threatening moments of contact between animals and humans. Wildfire seasons are now year-round. Low-lying nations threatened by sea level rise, like the Marshall Islands, are being forced to consider a terrifying, almost inconceivable choice: relocate the entire population or elevate the land. For the Marshallese, the latter would involve raising 1,200 islands scattered across 750,000 square miles of ocean. Early in 2020, and partway through compiling this anthology, the COVID-19 pandemic encircled the world, altering our lives in ways that are by now familiar. The catastrophic novel coronavirus was born out of humanity's complex and unstable relationship with wildlife. The way things are headed, this pandemic likely won't be the last. To use a metaphor that has grown uncanny, these visible effects of global warming are just the tip of the iceberg. In the public conversation about climate change, macro change tends to take center stage, and for good reason. It impacts the lives of millions and serves as an increasingly urgent reminder of the need for decisive action. But less told among the literature of climate change are the stories of individuals, how they're coping, or not, with the changes occurring in their own lives. That's the scale that this anthology, the world as we knew it seeks to highlight, not by turning away from global events, but by emphasizing the links between the individual, the collective, and the environmental. Sometimes the connections between the personal and the planetary can be hard to see, but once we start looking, we notice that they're everywhere. I'll stop there and turn it over to you, Tajja.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I don't think I've ever heard you read the intro out loud. It's really special, and I feel like so many of the images of it just really came to life for me. Especially, I love the image of the jar in one hand, the lid with 3 holes in the other. So thank you for that. I'm going to read from what's actually the book's first essay, and as Amy mentioned, one of our favorites, by the incredibly esteemed novelist and writer Lydia Millett, who we were so lucky to include as a contributor to this anthology. The essay is about living in the Sonoran Desert in very close proximity to the wildlife there, how living in that environment sort of shapes Lydia's sort of sense and scale of time, especially living among sort of the large saguaro cacti. And the essay is called "From This Valley, They Say You Are Leaving." I'm devoted to where I live. Some might say too devoted, since I've left people and jobs elsewhere to stay out here. Once, after a local utility sent me a letter announcing it planned to blade a swath across my patch of desert to lay some cable, I dissolved into a fit of sobbing. That was 15 years ago, and so far, the bulldozers haven't come. From what I can tell, they chose to blaze a shorter trail through the property next door instead, which happens to belong to my mother. She replanted a few bushes and cacti along the path they plowed, but you can still see, in the bare ground around those sparse plantings, the footprint of the machines. It's not that I experience the pride of ownership that real estate agents like to tout and ad copy. The phrase doesn't resonate with me, no matter how hard I reach for a feeling that might approximate it. I'd like to think ownership meant something beyond resale value, say, permission to protect a place from harm. But mostly, as far as I can tell, unless you're willing to lie down in their path, the bulldozers will come whether you own a place or rent it. It's far truer to say the land owns me. It has all the power in our relationship. Somehow it became my only right home as soon as I set foot here. I can't say exactly why, because my long, straight street, as you drive down it toward the turnoff for my house, looks almost ugly. I see prettier streets all the time. But as soon as I head up my winding dirt driveway, I find myself in a lush tumult of trees and cactus and shrubs, lush to the eye, though piercing to the touch. With the angle of the sloping land against the sky, and without the light pollution of Tucson on the other side of the mountains, I can sometimes stand out in my yard in the darkness, look up, and see not only the constellations, but the wide, hazy path of the Milky Way. The expanse of stars, the multiple mountain ranges visible from my balcony, the cactus and other otherworldly, curious forms of plant life all come together with a singular beauty. Wild animals wander through my yard, mule deer, bobcats, and collared peccaries that look like boars, which we call javelinas, foxes, coyotes, roadrunners, quail. Others alight on trees, owls, hawks, flickers, songbirds. Still others live down in the coolness of the earth, like the round-tailed ground squirrels that remind me of miniature prairie dogs, Harris's antelope squirrels that resemble chipmunks, many lizards, tortoises, and toads. My home lies adjacent to Saguaro National Park, whose low but dramatically pointed volcanic mountains are spiked with tall saguaro cacti, the iconic plants of the American Southwest you used to see in cartoons about the desert and cowboy movies. They're often 30 or 40 feet tall, with arms that make them look creaturely, spread out and upraised, as though they're constantly hailing you in greeting. There are other wondrous cacti as well, some in the shapes of paddles, others like barrels, Still others like clumps of breasts growing out of the ground or trees with thousands of spiny segments that get lit up gold by the setting sun. Woody plants called ocotillos with red flames for flowers, thorny trees with green bark. Still, it's the saguaros that most define the Sonoran Desert. These giants can weigh more than 5,000 pounds and, in good conditions, outlive people by dozens of years and sometimes centuries. One saguaro on the east side of the city, called Granddaddy, was 300 by the time it died in 1992. They're keystone species that many birds depend on for nesting, from woodpeckers to tiny elfin screech owls. Bats, bees, and birds pollinate them. Javelinas, coyotes, and tortoises eat their large fuchsia fruits, as do the Tohono O'odham, who've lived here for thousands of years. They make jelly from the fruit, along with wine that's consumed during rain ceremonies. But the so-called mega drought that has descended on the West since 2000 ranks among the greatest droughts of the past millennium. The animals that live here are hardy, but their water-saving adaptations depend on a fragile balance. The desert's green things grow and reproduce with painful slowness. My mother, who moved here a few years after I did, has rain gauges stuck into the ground across her land, tiny beakers with wire frames. She'll shake her head after a particularly dry summer monsoon season, telling me sadly how many inches we got, as though each fraction of an inch is gold. And it is, better than gold. Eventually, they say, the changing climate may plunge our region into conditions reminiscent of the Dust Bowl. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us all a bit of a sample for those who have not read the collection yet. Wonderful. I am going to I'm going to start the Q&A, and everyone here, please just don't feel shy to type in some comments or questions, and we will also try to get them to them. But yeah, I guess one of the things that I do think about a lot, so I am a scientist, ecologist who studies climate change, and I am also a creative writer, and also, an academic, right? So I guess one of the things I wanted to share with this group here is that many of us in academia, we sort of pass on our knowledge and findings via, peer-reviewed articles and reports. And, nowadays we have entire scientific journals, several scientific journals dedicated to climate change research. And of course, everybody knows about the IPCC that issues reports every so often. And I would say that, everyone I've talked to acknowledges the importance of storytelling. But I suspect there's still very few, spaces for those conversations to happen and places for that to, just to be sort of manifest, and places to integrate different types of knowledge and different types of observations. So the artistic, the scientific, and just the human, right? As we were talking about, which also relates to how do we connect personal to global. So what strikes me from reading these essays is that is done here. And one of the things I found reading through these was that in providing this personal perspective, these writers are also providing very accurate observations of the changes going on in their environments, and sort of was reminiscent to me of, on the one hand, like a citizen science approach to reporting changes, which we know has really taken off in the past decade or more. And then the other thing, it also reminded me of sort of how, observations were recorded maybe 100 years ago by natural historians. And I'm thinking that, I'm wondering, and this is maybe a bit of a controversial statement, but maybe our writers and artists and journalists are the natural historians of our time. because they are kind of providing us with, the facts as they exist via science, but at the same time introducing these very accurate observations, which in and of themselves, constitute a kind of knowledge. So I don't know if any of you would like to, any of our editors would like to comment on that, that from your perspective, like what you found in these essays, the content. And
Sure. Tajja, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm happy to start us off. I guess I really like the approach, the way that you describe the approach, Madhur, and I feel that that project of sort of of observation, of bearing witness, of description is one that really sort of broadened the field of the writers that we could ask to contribute to this anthology. And that was one of the things that was sort of most exciting about the idea when Amy first approached me, was that, there was the potential to bring into this conversation about the climate crisis writers who we might not necessarily have seen participating in it before. And that, that very much includes me. I sort of I came to this project as somebody who, was an editor and writer of essays, who worked very much in the space of personal narrative, but, hadn't thought of it as a vehicle for exploring, what Amy so aptly described as, what's usually figured as these sort of big global planetary crises. So that felt so fresh and original and democratizing and welcoming to me. And we saw it with the writers when we invited them too. So many people said, wow, nobody has asked me about this before, but I absolutely have something to say. My memories, are sort of preserved in this weird state of a place or a time that doesn't exist in the same way anymore. So yeah, that was just the sort of formal aspect, the kind of interdisciplinarity of it, the dilating of what climate writing is and who gets considered as a participant in that tradition, was all really exciting to me. And I think I see it as part of the kind of citizen journalism observation that you're describing. Amy, I'd love to hear what you think too.
Yeah, well, I share all of your thoughts, Tajja, on this, especially the idea that we try to incorporate as many voices and writing styles as possible. People from many different backgrounds who would have experienced the climate crisis differently because of their geographic locale, because of certain privileges that they may or may not have. And I think we succeeded. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so proud of this anthology. It's your question is so interesting, Madhur, because I know I didn't come to this collection thinking of it in terms of writing category as, science versus natural history. Approach that I took, and perhaps Tajja also took, was one of persuasive power. In other words, what is the type of writing that is actually going to be motivating for people to think and hopefully act more comprehensively on the climate crisis? And in fact, that's how the introduction ends, right? That we both acknowledge that this approach may not be the most intuitive, but we think it's among the most powerful. And I say that because, coming back to science for a moment, we are not short on scientific studies of the climate crisis. There are literally thousands of them, and there have been thousands of scientific studies since at least the late 19th century. I think people sometimes forget that this is not a new phenomenon by any means. And yet here we are, still lacking in widespread collective political action to make a difference. And so one reason why we took the approach with the personal essay is because they don't just impact the logos or the mind, right? They're not just facts and figures. They are persuasive because they're emotional and talk about what it is like to be a human being and all of our complicated existence on the planet. So hopefully that's helpful.
I think it is, and I think we it's always important to remind us and everyone that there's the science of many of these issues is known. Not to say that we don't need more scientific research, we do, but in terms of dealing with the crisis now, that's not what's limiting. We know what needs to be done. And yeah, I guess one more thing I'm going to highlight, and then I'm going to really invite people here to chime in with their questions. And you did sort of touch on this a little bit, and I do want everybody to be aware that the anthology does, one of the things it does is the writers, I suppose just by who they are and where they live and what their experiences are, do give us a very a wide variety of many different types of environments are brought up. So we have hot deserts, cold deserts, urban areas, backyards, tropical areas. So we really do get a sense of many different kinds of environments, which is nice. And I want to, share that usually, typically in academia, many of us, when we study things, we study only one type of environment. So what's also nice about reading an anthology from this type of perspective is you really do get immediately, because we live in so many different parts of the world, you get a sense of all of the different types of environments and how they are differentially being affected by climate change, right? So this move from global to personal is also a move from global to local. And we know that, another very concrete way to understand the impacts of climate change is to see that there's often extremely different local and unequal local impacts. So that's there, and something to very much discuss. And it really naturally also leads to interdisciplinary perspectives, I think, because we start to see intersections with different social issues, countries globally. Like literally, the anthology also spans a very broad geographic area, just through the writers, just through the perspectives and experiences of the writers, right? So North America, Thailand, Middle East, Antarctica, just to name a few of the geographical locations talked about in this. And sometimes those specifics, are lost in some of these other types of reporting, or it's too vast, perhaps, to look at in a snapshot, I suppose. So, it also kind of illustrates the international scope of the problem. And I know that at the university, we're really interested in something called internationalization, which, it's hard. Like, it's not something you can do top down, and so, it also strikes me that there could be a whole other anthology and many other more anthologies, right, by voices that are perhaps living in other parts of the world. So that could be a future project for some people here. I am going to, I don't know if any of you either want to respond to that. It was more of a comment than a question. But I think I'll ask, because I do see a couple of things coming into the chat here. There's some very specific questions about putting together the book. So I will hand those ones over to you. So Amy and Tajja, someone is asking about how the order of the essays was decided. And, did you try to group together certain themes or spread them out evenly and so on?
Just skimming the table of contents to try and get me back into that mindset. Amy, do you have any sort of immediate thoughts on how we would have been doing that?
Yeah, sure. I love craft questions, and kind of pulling the curtain aside to talk about behind the scenes. One thing I know I learned while putting this together, and this comes as a fan of anthologies. I love them because I love hearing collective voices on a single subject. I think they are such a powerful form of literature. But what it never really occurred to me is that one of the reasons why I enjoy them so much is because when they're done well, they have this own interior logic. So even though you are reading many different pieces by different people with different writing styles, writing about different locales and different subjects, it still feels like a comprehensive whole. And one aspect of organization that leads to that is the order. And so that is all to say, like Tajja and I worked together on this. We also worked with our editor at Catapult to try to determine what is the order that would lead readers on what feels like a connected, comprehensive journey from the first page to the second, even though they're going to be taken to places all over the world. And there's something kind of, excuse me, ineffable about that. It has as much to do, I think, with a gut feeling as any sort of actual logic or matrix that we could have used. Taking into consideration things like the cadences of their sentences, the geographic locations, just the rhythm of the work on the page. Yeah, Tajja, what do you think?
I agree with all of that. It is sort of like there is something ineffable about it. It is, multifactorial in the sense that sometimes it's, we thought about sort of geographic distribution. We thought about something as boring as length, for example. Like we don't want to put, something that's really long and sort of more stylistically experimental. We don't want to group all those pieces together. We'll probably want to, break that up with something that is, a bit shorter and more straightforward. We tried not to have too many essays about, similar environmental phenomena together. So it's not like fire, 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 drought, drought, drought. And I remember for the beginning and the end of the book specifically, those were pretty, like we both, I think, had very similar instincts about the opening and closing essays. Like we both felt that Lydia's was a sort of strong, welcoming, very sensory kind of on-ramp for the reader to find their way into the book. And I remember, Amy, from pretty early on, you were interested in having Delia Falconer's Signs and Wonders as the sort of closing note of the book, which was a call that I really supported. So I think a combination of sort of knowing, like having a strong intuitive sense of what we wanted the shape of the book to feel like and sort of collaborating on that shape, and then finding the right essays to sort of slot in to that shape to kind of create that curated experience that Amy describes.
Yeah, thanks, Tajja. I think I will also just acknowledge that at the beginning, I know I had this fear that we were going to have essays that were all kind of about the same thing. They were all going to feel very samey, because when you kind of zoom out and look at the scope of the literature of the climate crisis, there tend to be tropes, just like in any genre. And those tropes in the climate crisis, writing genre in particular, are being kind of beat over and over and over again for good reason, right? Because flooding continues to happen, wildfires continue to happen, extreme weather events continue to happen. But I was pleasantly surprised at the breadth and degree of difference that these essays contain, both in terms of their subject matter and the styles that they're written in. And I think that was really helpful to both of us in figuring out what the order should be to make the experience of reading the book the most interesting as possible to our readers. Madhur, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I was just going to relay some more of the questions from the chat. There's so many coming now, which is wonderful. Well, let's just start from, I was going to put a little call out to our early career researchers, because we have a group of graduate students and postdocs who read the book. We had a little reading group, and so I had told them to prepare some questions for us today, and I see one of them in the chat. So I'm going to ask that one. Or Olivia, if you're here, would you like to come on and ask it yourself?
Sure. I have a funny background right now, so
Oh.
but I and a dog. So anyway, my question, you two obviously got to know these essays really intimately, and I'm wondering what changes they made in your own lives in terms of how you relate to climate change in your environment, or yeah, if they did, I assume that they would have.
Yeah. Amy, I'm happy to speak to this one first.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Olivia, for that question. Absolutely. Amy's reading from the intro sort of it touched on this, but so much of this book was edited and assembled relatively early in the pandemic, when we were inside all the time. And being able to, it felt like, first of all, just an incredibly sort of intimate process and exchange with our writers, for them to be sort of trusting us with these narratives, and even just like the logistics of delivering essays like this under the kinds of stress that, we were all living and continue to live under. But for me personally, it made me reflect on my relationship to the natural world differently. I realized sort of how much I had kind of taken it for granted, to like, not to sound too sort of trite, but it made me sort of more aware of and alert to just the sensory experience of being in nature. And I think that's, one of the many gifts that working on this book has given me, and something that I've carried sort of beyond the editorial process.
Yeah, I guess for me, I've been reading and writing about and studying the literature of climate change for a long time. And by time we got to the point where we were compiling this essay, I would never be so egotistical to say I'd heard it all, right? But I'd heard a lot. And I'd read a lot about how the climate crisis was affecting people. And it was all in ways that some I could relate personally to, some I hadn't experienced, but I could sympathize with. But I'd heard a lot of it. And what this collection made me realize is that as much as I'd heard and read and learned, it's just the beginning. There are so many ways that this crisis is impacting people at an emotional, psychological, deeply personal level that we are just beginning to understand. And this book highlights a lot of those, many of which, again, just really opened my own eyes. And, Madhur, you had said we could write many, many anthologies about this. And I think that's true, just about the personal experiences of the climate crisis. So yeah, if anything, this book just brought home for me just how wide-reaching and huge and deeply personal this problem is.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I was just thinking about all of the stories that could be told, also not in English, So there's so much, so much we need to know and hear. Gosh, the questions are coming fast and furious now. And I'm so tempted to ask all of them, but let's, okay. The one that just came in was from somebody who is self-identifying as a younger viewer. And I really, really would love to give this person a voice here. So I'll ask the question. I don't know Gemma, but they're asking, as someone who hasn't read your book, it's been on my reading list for a while, and as a younger viewer, what do you hope readers will take from this book? I have never lived in the world that you knew. Wow. So I was also wondering if you took into consideration how to bring to life what your world was like for your youth readers. It makes total sense, Gemma. I think it's a great question.
I have some thoughts, Tajja, unless you would like to jump in first. Okay. So lots to unpack there, Gemma, and thank you so much for those questions. They're so important. So I once had the great pleasure of meeting Margaret Atwood, and who writes a lot about climate change in her fiction and in nonfiction. And I once asked her as a writer, what do you think the most important thing is for readers? And she said something that I, as an editor and a writer, really resonated with. And her answer wasn't just go vote, which of course we all should, everybody go vote. And her answer wasn't to, recycle more and travel less and use more electricity and less fossil fuels, though, we all have degrees of personal responsibility there as well. Her answer was, the most important thing we could all do is bear witness. And what she meant by that was tracking, writing down, acknowledging the changes that you are seeing in your everyday life, because it is an act of dignity that, or rather, it gives dignity to all those who don't have that power. And it helps us to remember what we had and what and who we are losing. And I found that to be incredibly powerful. And I think on one hand, this book is an act of witness. It's filled with many witnesses who have seen the world change as it's changing and is recording that. So, Gemma, someday when you are not a young viewer, you are a very, old person who's lived a very long and lovely life, and you're talking to who the young people will be then. Those young people will have a record of what's going on now. So that's one thing I think we could take away from this. But the other thing I want to say, though, Gemma, is when you say you don't know the world that we knew, that's true and it's not true. Okay. I mean, on the one hand, yes, we have left the station when it comes to climate stability, and that happened very quickly, just in the last 30 some years. On the other hand, the future is not yet written, and there is so much more transformation ahead of us. And so I would say, bear witness to it and confront it, and take those actions that you feel empowered to take to make a difference, even if it's in your own community, because that's where change starts first.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna invite, actually, Terry. Are you still here? Terry Harpel, because you have a very long question here, and I think we should invite you to come on. And could you please, Terry is the
I'm here.
director.
I'm here, Mother.
Wonderful. Yeah, I was going to say, would you just introduce yourself and the institute that you lead?
Oh, that's
over there.
You're very kind. This is not about me at all. It's about them. But okay, so
no, we're interested in knowing that these.
I teach at the University of Florida, where I run an initiative called Imagining Climate Change, where we try to create a venue for connections between the humanities and the physical sciences, biological sciences, and so on. And we were extremely privileged a couple of years ago to have Madhur come and give some lectures and to connect with our students in our community here. So that's ICC, Imagining Climate Change. You're right, I asked too long a question, but I'm gonna sort of sum it up if I can. It's a great book, wonderful, moving, powerful, generative wisdom. I'll be teaching portions of it in my undergraduate course this semester on the literature of resilience. And I congratulate you, both of you, and of course, all the contributors. One of the essays that impressed me the most is Mira Subramanian's Leap. And because she does something really interesting, and those who haven't read that essay yet, or those who have will know what I'm talking about, there are markers in the text where she indicates the global atmospheric CO2 level in specific years of her life. And that those objective markers are keyed to observations about the transformation of self and the transformation of emotion. So we get these ostensibly objective markers correlated as almost like chapter headings or sub-chapter headings for these subjective, emotionally charged changes. And she uses this term later in the essay, ecstasis. I'm going to quote her now. The ancient Greek word for that moment of dislocation when we step out of ourselves, become unbound, when something beyond our bodies engages us to the point that we transform. And that's exactly what's happening with these wonderful markers. It seems to me that this is sort of an ethos of the book overall, which is the uncertain, inconstant, and very productive correlation of objective planetary change and subjective transformation. And I just would like to invite you to talk a bit more about that, because I think that that's, in my mind, it's one of the most powerful aspects of the project, and one that I know that will be useful for me as an educator when I talk to students about how they correlate the two. Thank you for giving me the chance to ask the question.
Tajja, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to start. Thank you so much, Terry, for that question. I think for me, that did feel like a very sort of core project of the book, and felt like, part of what I described earlier about sort of dilating the conversation, sort of encouraging more sort of interdisciplinarity and more writers and readers too, to kind of, join the conversation about the sort of the subjective changes that they were experiencing, and also kind of model a kind of attention or relationship to so many of the facts and figures about the climate crisis that are out there. I think for me, my hope is that by sort of juxtaposing the two and kind of putting them into conversation in this way, it does sort of create more space for people to, it makes the data feel more accessible and graspable, and kind of models a way for readers to understand how it relates to their own lives, how they relate to their own lives, and just sort of continues the project of kind of including more voices in this conversation. Amy, I would love to hear from you on this too.
Yeah, well, Tajja, I think you're absolutely right about the interdisciplinarity aspect of that. It's interesting, Terry, and by the way, thank you again for your kind words and for teaching this book. That just means the world to me, and I know it means to Tajja as well. So the thing about Mira's essay is that those numbers, they were not hard to find, and they were not hard to fact check, because they are in so many scientific reports, which kind of comes back to one of the things I was saying earlier, which is that we are not short on climate science. And yes, we need a lot more of it. Again, do not stop doing science, folks. Scientists will save us. But there's so much science out there. And yet, facts and figures alone are not what's motivating the populace to take action. On the flip side of that, there's also the possibility of writing very emotionally about the climate crisis, but absent those facts and figures, they don't necessarily have the gravitas that would appeal to the type of reader that needs those facts and figures to feel rooted and persuaded by what the essays are saying. And so when we bring together that pathos and logos, then to my mind, it makes the essays in this book so much more powerful and persuasive than either of those approaches would be on their own. So yeah, again, for me, it all comes back to the rhetorical persuasive power of bringing science and personal narrative together.
Wonderful, thank you. We are running towards the end of our time together. Let me have a quick look through to see if there's any short, quick answers that you could provide people with their but everything, everything so far has been so enriching. I want to say that before we end. Someone wants to know if it's going to be turned into an audiobook. That should be pretty quick to answer. Or if it has already, I don't know.
It is in the process of being turned into an audiobook.
Are you will each of the writers narrate, or how is it going to work?
I believe there's just going to be a single narrator who, Amy, is that right? Who reads the entire collection?
That's the direction that the team is currently going in. We're still settling on the details, but hopefully it'll be settled and available to the public pretty soon.
Wonderful. Let's see if there's any one little quick question here. Giving soul to data. Yes, that's a nice takeaway from contribute. Catherine. Catherine, I'm glad you could finally join. And yeah, let me I think, you know what, we are at the end. There were a couple of questions in there. Maybe what we can do, Leanne, is save the chat and share it with, I just did that. I've saved the chat and we can share it with Amy, and perhaps if there's anything that didn't get answered, we could add that later. But let me now just take a minute to thank everybody for joining us today. When this book, when I became aware that this book was coming out, I didn't even think twice. I immediately said, I'm going to host them. We're going to have a session at GIER. We're going to make it happen. It's the middle of summer, but we're going to do it anyway. And if we have 5 people come, that's enough. If we have more, that would be great. I had a feeling that this book was going to really, because of the people involved, because of all the work that, Amy, you have been doing over these past few years through your blog and all of your other work, because of your work, Tajja, as a journalist and writer, and because of your general approach of asking people the question that, and knowing that these are people who don't normally get asked that question, I just love that approach. So thank you very much to both of you for joining us at GIER.
For having us.
Yeah, thank you. This is really lovely.